not be seen tonight in order to bring you this special program. This is a CBS News special report. Crisis in Korea. Brought to you in color by Western Electric, the manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell system, as part of their continuing coverage of important news events.
Good evening, I'm Mike Wallace. This day has seen the United States continuing its diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis posed by the North Korean seizure of the spy ship Pueblo. Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson at the Kremlin, Ambassador Arthur Goldberg at the United Nations, and President Johnson in Washington searched for a way to free the ship and her crew without the necessity of resorting to force, which could, of course, vastly widen the war in Southeast Asia. But no one so far is hopeful that the Russians in Moscow will help, nor that a concert of powers at the United Nations, nor even the threat of force by Washington will prove effective. The North Koreans remain adamant. They show no inclination to return the ship and her crew. Indeed, today, they implied the possibility that the men of the Pueblo would be put on trial as criminals. President Johnson addressed the nation in mid-afternoon from the White House. He assessed the motives of the North Koreans, and he gave them a carefully worded warning.
The North Koreans are apparently attempting to intimidate the South Koreans and are trying to interrupt the growing spirit of confidence and progress in the Republic of Korea. These attacks may also be an attempt by the communists to divert South Korean and United States military resources, which together are now successfully resisting aggression in Vietnam. This week, the North Koreans committed yet another wanton and aggressive act by seizing an American ship and its crew in international waters. Clearly, this cannot be accepted.
This is Dan Rather at the White House. That statement was not intended as a threat. To the contrary, President Johnson is doing everything possible to avoid giving the impression of belligerency. Every act, every word of the past few days has been designed to maintain the appearance of cool steadiness. Cautious, controlled determination is the way White House aides describe the president's attitude. Unless there is some new rash act by the North Koreans, there will be no military showdown before next week, and perhaps not even then. Mr. Johnson wants the focus the next several days to be on the United Nations. He wants it clearly understood that the North Koreans have committed a major provocation and that the United States is doing everything possible to avoid military retaliation. The president does not believe North Korea intended the Pueblo incident to provoke any new war. He is convinced that there is a connection between the ship's capture and the Vietnam War. What he intends to find out over the weekend is how much North Korea and the Russians are willing to gamble in support of the North Vietnamese. Dan Rather, CBS News, the White House.
The most visible diplomatic maneuvering today came at the United Nations, where the United States had called for an emergency session of the Security Council. It was hardly a hopeful session, consisting mainly of charge and countercharge. Ambassador Arthur Goldberg insisted once again and demonstrated on a map that the Pueblo was in international waters when she was boarded by the North Koreans. Ambassador Platon Morozov replied for the Soviet Union.
Now, all of this is verified not by reports solely from the Pueblo. All of this is verified by reports from the North Korean vessels. Mr. President, it is incontrovertible from this type of evidence, which is physical evidence of international Morse code signals and voice reports, that the Pueblo, when first approached and when seized, was in international waters well beyond the 12-mile limits by reports from this is verified.
Ambassador Arthur Goldberg insisted once again and demonstrated on a map that the Pueblo was in international waters when she was boarded by the North Koreans. Ambassador Platon Morisov replied for the Soviet Union.
Now, all of this is verified not by reports solely from the Pueblo. All of this is verified by reports from the North Korean vessels. Mr. President, it is incontrovertible from this type of evidence, which is physical evidence of international Morse code signals and voice reports, that the Pueblo, when first approached and when seized, was in international waters well beyond the 12-mile limits, and that the North Koreans knew this. This was no mere incident, no case of mistaken identity, no case of mistaken location. It was nothing less than a deliberate, premeditated, armed attack on a United States naval vessel on the high seas.
I must say, Mr. President, that as far as I'm concerned, the captain is best able to know at what point his vessel was when it was detained by a craft of the Korean People's Democratic Republic. Bucher admitted that that vessel, of which he was captain, upon instructions of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, was engaged in espionage activities in the territorial waters of the Korean People's Democratic Republic.
Now, Mr. President, I'm very ready to recognize the Soviet experience in coerced and fabricated confessions. But I had really hoped that in light of Soviet history, the Soviets had learned to place little credence in them.
This is Richard C. Hottelet, CBS News, UN Headquarters. The United States and the Soviet Union disagreed sharply on just about every point of fact and principle, which suggests that the Security Council will do a great deal more arguing than agreeing on the Korean crisis. Back in 1950, when the Korean War first came to the Council, the Soviet Union was not there to veto UN action. It had walked out over the China issue. Now it is here, representing North Korea's interests, demanding immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops and ruling out United Nations intervention, just as in Vietnam. Washington, on the other hand, wants the Security Council to obtain safe return of the Pueblo and her crew and to restore the effectiveness of the Korean armistice. But Ambassador Goldberg did not suggest how that might be done in the face of the Russian veto. He spoke with restraint, urging diplomatic solutions, but adding the conditional phrase, if at all possible. And he touched only lightly on the right of self-defense against armed attack, but enough to remind everyone here that the American eagle has claws. Richard C. Hottelet, CBS News, United Nations.
Clean air. Clean water. They're worth fighting for. At Western Electric plants, all across the country, we've been fighting for cleaner air and water for years. Fighting pollution doesn't make the telephone equipment Western Electric builds for the Bell telephone companies any better. But we breathe a little easier, knowing you do.
The routine process of espionage by whatever means goes on daily around the world. We do it, our adversaries do it. It is a fact of life in the international community. But the North Korean seizure of the Pueblo is surely the most dramatic and could turn out to be the most explosive such incident since the U-2 plane of Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960. The mission of an espionage vessel like the Pueblo was described for CBS News correspondent Joseph Benty by David Kahn, an expert on codes from the American Cryptogram Association.
Well, it seems to me that the Pueblo was attempting to get as much electronic and radio emissions from Korea and practically as far back perhaps as Siberia, northern Siberia, as it possibly could. This material then is tape recorded, and some of it is analyzed on the spot, but most of it, I believe, is sent back to the United States, probably to the National Security Agency near Washington, where it's then analyzed further and studied for whatever intelligence can be obtained from it.
I know there's no way that you could possibly know the exact number of such vessels operating, but again, an educated guess, could you put any kind of an underline here so we would have some idea as to how extensive this sort of operation might be?
Well, that's hard to say. I would say that there might be about perhaps half a dozen such vessels around the world. We know, of course, that there are 2,000 intercept positions, which means one man at one radio listening set in manned posts around the world. And then, of course, we have airplanes that fly around continuously, doing the same thing, monitoring these emissions, listening as much as possible to Soviet and Communist Chinese radio chatter and Morse code enciphered messages. And finally, of course, we have the satellites which swing overhead and pick up such things as even transcontinental microwave telephone conversations, long-distance telephone conversations of the Russians.
What has been the history of this kind of electronic surveillance? Is it very common?
Yes, it's very common, and I should add right away that it's done by both sides. The Soviet Union sends its Badger airplanes very close to our dew line in the north of Canada, and at the same time, as you know, they have picket ships or trawlers, disguised as trawlers, cruising the coast right here off New York, off Long Island, off Massachusetts and all, and even off Cape Kennedy, to get as much information as they can pick up, similar to what we're doing.
And indeed, Russian intelligence-gathering trawlers have been spotted and tracked by U.S. forces for years near both the east and west coasts of the United States. While our forces were engaged in military maneuvers, these Russian trawlers were spotted by the Navy on the edge of a test area in the Pacific where we fire missiles. And at least once there were Russian trawlers in the vicinity of the splashdown area of the Gemini astronauts. This Russian trawler was gathering information near Guam, where American B-52 bombers were taking off and returning from missions over Vietnam. During Marine Corps maneuvers in Puerto Rico, this Russian intelligence trawler cruised offshore to listen and to observe. And just this afternoon, our cameras found 3 Russian trawlers 65 miles off Montauk Point, Long Island. Ostensibly, they were fishing under agreement with the United States. But a United States naval destroyer watched their progress. We try to keep an eye on all of them. For instance, like this one filmed by the Navy off San Diego, California, we see only a trawler. They can see and hear much more. And one place the Russian ships watch us carefully, of course, is in the Gulf of Tonkin off North Vietnam. CBS News correspondent Don Webster reports.
Every day, dozens of these planes take off in the Gulf of Tonkin to bomb North Vietnam. The average distance to the shore is about 100 miles. And on every flight, those planes must fly over or near this ship. It's a Russian trawler, and there's been one here ever since the United States started bombing North Vietnam. Now, neither the United States nor Russia has ever officially said what this trawler is doing here. But many suspect it's loaded with secret electronic gear, and it's monitoring our flights, warning Hanoi when we're going to strike, how many planes are in the air, and which direction they're headed. It's in international waters, so there's not much we can do about it, except this. An American ship, a fleet tug or a destroyer, has for more than 3 years stayed just a few hundred yards from the Russian trawler. While the carriers bomb the north, the Russians watch the carriers, the Americans watch the Russians. The skipper of the current American ship is Lieutenant Dale Alexander. What is this Russian ship supposed to do?
Under Lloyd's of London Registry of Ships, this vessel is classed as a fishing vessel. However, we have never observed any fishing, use of nets, lines, or support by a mothership or transfer of fish from this ship to a secondary ship.
I notice over the ship they're flying a vertical red, white, red signal. What is that sign supposed to mean?
Mr. Webster, under international rules of the road, this red, white, red signal indicates that the ship is engaged in launching or recovering aircraft, underwater cable activities, or replenishment. However, you can see he's not an aircraft carrier, he has no cable, and there's no other ships in the vicinity other than our own ships.
At the United Nations today, U.S. Ambassador Arthur Goldberg underlined the assertion that the Pueblo was outside the 12-mile limit and therefore in international waters and not subject to legal seizure by the North Koreans. But what if the Pueblo had been inside the 12-mile limit? What are the legalities surrounding the seizure of ships at sea? Professor Myers McDougall, an expert on the law of the sea at Yale University, explains to CBS News correspondent Ike Pappas.
Looking at it purely from an international law point of view, how would you summarize the Pueblo incident?
I think, Mr. Pappas, under the facts as we presently know them, there was no question about the unlawfulness of the North Korean seizure. If the ship was in international waters upon the high seas, the gathering of intelligence is a well-recognized purpose within the freedom of the seas, that all peoples are protected in this, all peoples with navies, certainly with large commitments engage in this all the time. Both us and the Russians have ships of this kind all over the world, and there's no ground for the seizure of such ship as long as it's in the high seas, the international waters. If the ship were within the territorial waters of North Korea, and we've already seen there's grave doubt about what the reach of territorial waters is today, I think still North Korea's only recourse would be to order the ship out, and it could seize it only if it disobeyed this order, that even warships have a right of innocent passage through territorial waters. The International Court of Justice held this in the famous Corfu Channel case. But a coastal state can protect itself from unique dangers to its security by ordering the ship out. It can only seize the ship if it refuses to go, or if it can establish self-defense, that there's such an overwhelming necessity of using the military instrument that its security will be irreparably prejudiced if it doesn't use it.
Public reaction to the seizure of the Pueblo has been various, some of it belligerent, some of it cautious, all of it anxious. And we'll explore some of that reaction in a moment.
Who in the world would treat a telephone this way? Western Electric. Western Electric builds rugged phones and tests some of them beyond endurance. Chances are, the phone your Bell telephone company installs will never need repair. You can take your Bell phone for granted, because we don't at Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell system.
Under normal circumstances, an incident like the seizure of the Pueblo would be greeted by unanimous expressions, official and unofficial, public and private, of the need for a swift military reaction. And there is some of that in Washington. For instance, today, after the Senate Foreign Relations Committee met for 3 hours with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, one of its members, Albert Gore of Tennessee, a dove on Vietnam, commented on the mood of official Washington.
Well, it is a crisis. There's a greater atmosphere of crisis here than I've seen at any time since the confrontation on the Cuban missiles. There is a definite possibility of hostilities breaking out on this new front. Not because we wish it. It might be occasioned by either the High Communist Command or the wild boldness of the dictator of North Korea. There is a definite possibility.
What is the likelihood of an additional call-up of further reserves, Senator Gore?
Oh, I think it's inevitable.
How soon?
This I don't know.
How many?
I don't know that, but I would think most.
You think a full call of reserves is coming shortly?
I'm not prepared to say that.
In your best judgment?
I would think it's likely.
And some thoughtful men are asking questions. Retired General James Gavin, former U.S. ambassador to France and a critic of administration policy in the Far East, gave a skeptical assessment of the affair of the Pueblo.
Well, what was my reaction, is my reaction to the Pueblo incident? Well, first of all, my immediate reaction with my background is that it was a debacle that should have been avoided, and the military should have been better prepared to deal with this sort of confrontation. I can't conceive of a prudent military commander at any echelon whatsoever behaving in such a manner as to contemplate the likely loss of a ship of that character with all that highly classified electronics gear aboard. So let's face it was a real goof. It was a mistake. Now, I would seriously hope that action is being taken right now to provide continuing fighter cover or run through exercises that are sure to understand the operating procedures in such an event to get fighter cover out there at once. These things should be worked out with greater care, obviously. That first concerns me. The next is we must be realistic now about what's happened. The commander in the so-called confession said that he was 7.6 miles from land. Now, that may not have been a confession on his part, and Washington said it was not. But there are certain things in there that suggest that they surely talked to him. They got a lot of personal details in there. Now, we're trying to determine whether or not it was within their territorial waters or in international waters. If it was within their territorial waters, well, we were in error. We shouldn't have been there, and they were right in challenging and questioning us being there, and we're in very serious trouble. We might lose the ship, we might lose the men. If, in fact, however, this was in international waters, this is a matter of international piracy in the high seas, and we simply can't tolerate that. And we would probably have to use military force, hopefully through the UN, to recover the ship and get some adjustment made. This last question, and I've only talked about two things, this last question, the right or wrongness of what we've done, yet must be resolved, and it would be most imprudent and unwise but once use military force without knowing where we really stand legally in this situation. But you can't always trust what you hear from Washington, you know. You remember the U-2 incident where the plane was on weather reconnaissance, and the White House said that. And they were just drawn into that, you know, and then finally here's the pilot and that plane in Moscow. So let's wait and see what's going on. I'll admit, I don't know.
Gavin was speaking at Dartmouth College. Chairman Mendel Rivers of the House Armed Services Committee said today that President Johnson should issue an ultimatum that if the Pueblo is not returned by the North Koreans, a North Korean city would, quote, disappear from the face of the earth. Retired General Mark Clark was once UN Supreme Commander in Korea. He spoke recently with CBS News correspondent George Herman. And he talked bitterly of that Korean War and the fact that we settled then not for a victory, but for negotiations in return for an end to the fighting.
Well, I didn't think we should have gone to the peace table in Korea, but lacking the determination to win the war. And as General MacArthur said, there's no substitute for victory, and I think that if we had had a victory in our first test of arms with communism in Korea, we would not now be in Vietnam. So I felt that we should go ahead and win the war and give him a sound defeat. And I didn't mean that we should necessarily slug it out man for man on the field of battle, because we can't swap a dead American for 50 or any given number of Chinese or North Korean or North Vietnamese communists. But we should have won that war with our more sophisticated weapons, mainly our air and naval power, and I was convinced that we could do it without triggering a World War III.
What's the situation there now as far as American interests are concerned?
Well, I was back in Korea not too very long ago, And it was on the occasion of, I believe, of their 13th anniversary of the signing of the armistice. And I went back as the guest of the President of Korea. And I went to all of the places I had been as the commander, and helicoptered into Panmunjom. And there we have just a cessation of hostilities. Along the 38th parallel, we now have about 50,000 American troops in full battle array, patrolling every night, guns loaded, shooting at each other. And you have 200,000 or 300,000 South Koreans along the rest of the 38th parallel, all ready to go into action, and maybe 500,000 communists. So it's merely a stopping of the war. It's a war that the communists could, at the drop of the hat, open up and put the squeeze play on us. Now, when I signed the armistice in Korea as the United Nations commander, I read on behalf of the 16 nations that fought with me a statement that said, if there is further aggression in Korea on the part of the communists, we will not sit by as we did with our hands tied behind us, but we'll step out and we'll win this war and hit you in your home bases or wherever is necessary to keep you from maintaining your armies in the field.
Some sort of squeeze play is clearly on in Korea. What moves can the United States make next? An assessment in a moment.
Your family doctor sees something unusual. He wants to check with a heart specialist 1,000 miles away. So with a medical data set made by Western Electric, your cardiogram instantly appears before the distant specialist for his analysis. Data speeds from machine to machine, and doctor talks to doctor over regular telephone lines to save time, to save lives. Western Electric makes other data phone data sets, so your Bell Telephone Company can serve you in other ways too, like helping banks rush data to give you faster service, helping airlines to request and confirm your reservations in seconds. Making data phone data sets to move information at the speed of light is one of Western Electric's jobs as manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell system.
In Washington tonight, there is an atmosphere of deep concern. We are faced by an adamant North Korea, an evidently adamant Soviet Union, and a variously bemused or aroused public opinion here at home. What are Washington's options now? What move can the administration make next? Some observations from CBS News diplomatic correspondent Marvin Call.
Twice this week, the United States went to Russia for help. Twice it got none. And yet a third effort, and perhaps even a fourth, will doggedly be made to engage Russia's interest. But Soviet experts, even those in the government, see little to no hope of Russian assistance for two reasons. First, as reflected by Russia's UN delegate today, Moscow does not believe that the ship was in international waters. And second, Russia has very little real leverage with North Korea. Fact is, many foreign diplomats here simply cannot work up too much enthusiasm for the American case. As one of them put it, espionage is not a righteous basis for military retaliation. Nevertheless, the administration is orchestrating its actions along the lines of the Cuban Missile Crisis. One option under high-level consideration is a naval quarantine of North Korea. Marvin Kalb, CBS News, Washington.
And so tonight, 4 days after the seizure, the Pueblo rests in Wonsan Harbor, her 83-man crew held captive by North Korea. Tomorrow, when the UN Security Council meets again at 10:30, the diplomatic effort will be resumed. And tonight, undoubtedly, private diplomatic efforts will go on. America has warned North Korea not to bring the Pueblo's men to trial as criminals, and the International Red Cross already has made overtures in their behalf. Their safety, obviously, is paramount on the White House's cautious handling of the problem. The Pueblo itself means little except as a symbol, for the Navy says her secret coding machine was destroyed before the seizure, and there was little else in her equipment to compromise the national security. As for purely military efforts, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier Enterprise, shadowed tonight ironically by a Soviet spy ship, leads a task force in the seas off Korea. The president says the military is ready, but for now, the crisis remains in the hands of the diplomats. This is Mike Wallace, CBS News. Good night.
This has been a CBS News special report. Crisis in Korea. Brought to you in color by Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System, the people who provide telephones and equipment that connects them.